Hello, welcome to the Positive Posting Conversation, the show about how to have a better relationship with your dog and cat. I'm Zazie Todd, author of the books Bark, Wag and Purr, and creator of companion animal psychology blog. My co-host, Kristi Benson, is a dog trainer and anthropologist, and she also works at the Academy for Dog Trainers. We can't give advice on your pet, so if you have concerns, see your dog trainer, cat behaviourist, or veterinarian as appropriate. Thanks for joining us today. Sometimes research on dogs and cats really gets people talking, but how should ordinary pet guardians evaluate the science? And what does it mean if you feel like you're really not sure about the findings? Welcome to the Positive Post in Conversation. I'm Zazie Todd. I'm here as always with my friend and co-host Kristi Benson. Hey Kristi, it's great, isn't it, that so many people are interested in learning more about what science tells us about dogs and cats?
Absolutely. We love science. We love the scientific process and method, so we're here for it.
Yeah, and I love that so many people are interested because so much science is actually very relevant to people's ordinary lives with their dog or with their cat as well. So I think it's really useful, and it's also really good to talk about how people can evaluate it, because if you yourself are not a scientist, sometimes it can leave you thinking, or with questions about it. And it's good to share some ideas, I think, about how to talk about it. So before we get into this talking about science, though, I just want to say there is also kind of an ethical stance, and it's worth knowing that there are ethical approaches that are not dependent on research, that kind of more reflect how you feel about dogs and cats. So one of those ethical approaches, and it is backed up by research, but you might have it just as an ethical stance, is the idea that dogs and cats are sentient beings who deserve a good life. And I think everyone who listens to this podcast will feel that way about their own pets. And in the research, that sometimes gets called an animal rights perspective, but that name of it is different from how we might talk about animal rights in another perspective, like in ordinary conversations. So it's really more about animal welfare. And I think evaluating research is quite tricky if you're not a scientist, because if you are a scientist, you can go to the paper and you will look very carefully at the method and at the results section to see exactly how they did it and how they did the stats. And if you're not a scientist, sometimes that is completely incomprehensible, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I mean, I think there's a couple of separate issues even with that. Like, number one, the stats. I actually took a stats course, and even though I passed it, I have no ability to understand stats. And whenever I have a question about stats, or if I see stats and there's sort of like this assumption that they're saying one thing or the other, I usually go and ask someone who I know is good with that. So I think, understanding that, yes, this paper actually says what it's saying it says is one thing. And the other thing I think is the ability just generally to understand how science is done in any particular discipline. And I think way back in the Pleistocene, when I did my master's degree, I did it on animal bone archaeology, and I could understand animal bone archaeology papers on my specific area, which was a historic site. But that didn't mean that I was comfortable even with animal bone archaeology in a different area or of a different species, like, say, fish. I would not have been able to look at a paper about animal bone archaeology if it was about fish and been competent to even discuss it. So I think there's sort of some expertise needed to sort of unpack the science. And I think it can be tricky for sure.
Yeah, and I used to teach stats, including multivariate stats, which is the hard, really quite hard stats. I used to teach that to unwilling students. Even when I was a PhD student, undergrads had to learn about that. They didn't really want to know, but I mean, it's hard. And I think even for a research paper that's published, there may be different people on the team who've brought different bits of expertise to the topic. So there may be one person on the team or two people on the team who've done the stats, and other people who brought other things to it. So that's useful to know. And I think that means if you're looking at a paper and you're stumped trying to understand something, then that helps you feel a bit better, because it does take a lot of expertise to do these things. And I've remembered another proviso that I should mention, which is that sometimes these days, I see people mention research studies in arguments on social media, and they are studies that do not exist. Someone has gone to an AI and said, "What is the research on this topic that says blah, blah?" And the
Mhm.
AI has made something up, including potentially the names of real people, potentially even the name of a real journal, but more often a kind of made up journal. And I've seen this in discussions where people are citing evidence for their view, and I'm like, but that is not a real paper. So I guess the very first step is to verify, is this actually a paper that you can click on and go and read a link? That's one thing. So if you can go and read the paper, and at least these days it is much easier than ever to get hold of a copy of a paper if you want to. And also, it's useful to know that in most cases, if you email the author of a piece of research, they will usually be happy to send you a copy of it. Not always, and sometimes it might take them a while to do it because they might be very busy, but they
Right.
will usually be happy to send you a copy. So you can always get a copy that way as well. So
Yeah.
I mean, research says lots of really useful things about dogs and about cats and about breeds and behavior and training methods and how we interact with them and enrichment and things like that. So there's a whole lot of different types of science that are interesting here. I don't know which types you're most interested in. Obviously, for me, is stuff on dog training methods and stuff on enrichment are what I mostly pay attention to.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have like a favorite sub-discipline within the dog training research world. I find, I sometimes get these emails from uh is it academia? I get emails about, here's a dog paper you might be interested in. And I'm always like, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. That is an interesting topic. One thing I wish that there was research on is more research on acquired bite inhibition, which I think is something that would be so useful for us as practitioners. But I haven't seen yet.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. So, I mean, science doesn't have all the answers for us yet. And I think that can sometimes be one of the tantalizing things when we look at the research study and we think, well, that's really interesting. And now I really, really want to know the answer to this other question that they weren't able to look at in the paper because you can't look at everything in one study. You have to kind of narrow it down to something that is manageable that you can do. I mean, you're not writing a book, you're doing one research study and you're not publishing a whole lifetime's work. It's just like one thing. So scientists have to narrow things down to specific questions that they
Mhm.
want to look at. And the other thing that's important to bear in mind is that the results of one individual study don't necessarily tell us very much. It's when we look at a group of studies that are ideally using different methods and that are pointing to the same kind of result that we get really excited and we know that we've got something here which is quite significant. So even if there's one study that points to something a little bit different, well, then you have to think about why is that different? And that's when looking at the method can be really, really helpful. And
I
because
think Yeah, it's just something that pops into my mind is when we approach these research studies as dog professionals or as dog guardians, we're not necessarily thinking about them as a peer reviewer of a paper, But I think it might be useful if we look at these papers because, like you said, like the way that the scientific method works, it's not like they can go, is cat better than dog? Like it has to be, it has to be, they're looking at a very specific question that they can address using a very specific method. So I think when we're opening up these papers to sort of set us into the mind of going, hey, how does the scientific method work? How does science work? And approaching our journey through that paper with that sort of mindset is useful.
Yes, and, like, if we were thinking, "Is cat better than dog?" Well, in what way is cat better than dog? Is cat better than dog at catching a mouse in the house? And then, well, which kind of dog? Because are we comparing to my Shih Tzu would not be interested, or are we comparing to a terrier or some other kind of dog which has been bred to catch vermin? And that's gonna be a different kind of question. And how are we gonna assess this? And ethically, do we care about what's happening to the mice? Are we gonna use real mice? For this study? Or do we think, no, actually, we don't want the mice to come to any harm, so we're going to use the scent of
You're
mice
going to
and
use
see
radio controlled mice.
radio controlled mice with the scent of mice, like mouse urine on them or something. Can cat detect radio controlled mice better than dog, for example? It
Let's do this.
the more
Audience,
you
send
think
us
about
money and we will do this project.
We will have fun getting dogs and cats to play with radio-controlled mouse toys and see what happens. And then maybe another question is, well, what do people think about it? And then you're talking about questionnaires as well. So, I think one thing I see from some people is that people don't really know how to evaluate like questionnaires compared to experiments, and they tend to be asking slightly different questions. And I think one thing that's really useful to know about questionnaires is that typically someone hasn't just sat down and thought of a load of questions and then just asked them, like, Christy, do you like cats better than dogs? Well, that's not a very good questionnaire. Typically, when people are designing questionnaires, very often actually they're using questionnaires that have been designed and tested again and reused in multiple studies. So they
Mhm.
become scales that are very well evaluated. And we know that you can give it to one person one day and you can give it to them a few weeks later and you're going to get the same result. And we
Mhm.
also know that they're actually measuring something in the real world. So, you know, if I
Mhm.
have a question about Christy, is cat better than dog? It's actually going to reflect your feelings about apricot compared to your dogs, for example, as opposed to something else that you might happen to, to be
Yeah.
thinking of on the day. So, questionnaire studies actually are really, really useful, and a lot of work goes into designing them. And that's the other thing. I think if you do a good research study, it can look very simple. It's like any other kind of skill. If you do it well, it may look quite easy, but actually it hides how much work has gone into, getting to that point where you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And social science is a thing, y'all. It takes skills and training and education. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a reason people go and spend a long time doing these things. And then, so we have questionnaire studies, and questionnaires are really useful. And one of the places, as an example, where we do have a lot of questionnaire studies is, of course, in research on dog training methods and the approaches that people use to assess dog training methods. And that research shows that there are many, many risks to the use of aversive methods. And of course, these questionnaires have been designed in different ways over the years. And just as an example, you can't go to an ordinary pet guardian and say, do you use positive punishment to train your dog? Because they'll be like, what? I don't know what that is. So you can't use jargon in these. And like, this is one of the things that if you were looking at a study and you're going into the method section, you could look at the specific questions that are used. Sometimes they're hidden away in supplementary material and you have to click an extra link to see them, but you can look and you can actually see. And so, as an example, one of the ways in which some scientists have dealt with that is that they've written examples of positive punishment and they show them to people and say, do you use these methods? Or to what extent do you use these methods on a scale from 1 to 7, for example? And that becomes something that's much easier for people to understand because you have to be speaking the same language as the people that you're studying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I could talk about research methods for a long time, and I'm gonna make sure we don't spend forever on questionnaires. But I
No,
think it's worth.
I think it's important. I think there's a little bit of, not aversion to questionnaires, but lack of trust,
Yeah.
maybe.
I think a lot of people don't understand how questionnaires are developed. And then there is kind of an important proviso that if you find something from a questionnaire study, like people who say they use aversive methods also say that their dog is less obedient, which is the case from multiple different studies, that this isn't necessarily showing a causal link. It's not telling you which direction the causality goes in. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. And this is where it helps to have other kinds of research and other questionnaires to look at as well. But I think one thing that we see people say sometimes is that they say correlation doesn't prove causation. That's true, but then they stop there and they don't think, okay, well, what might be the causation? And it's thinking about that causation that can be really helpful and really useful. And it can be studies that start with showing causation correlations that end up proving causation in the end. And I think the famous example of that would be to do with research on tobacco and cancer. And for a long, long time, people would say there's an association between smoking and increased cancer, but it was just, in quotes, a correlation. And it took a long time before it was shown that actually there was a causation there. And of course, now we know. So you don't just throw something out and say, oh, it's just a correlation. It's not of interest. It's of huge interest. And then have to use that information to work out what is actually going on.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think, like you said, it's not just of interest in how can we figure it out, but it's of interest in just thinking about it. So if there's this correlation between, you know, disobedience, I'm using air quotes here, and aversives use, is then as dog practitioners, if the correlation or if the causation is, dogs who have behavior problems are more likely to experience aversive consequences, that's something we need to know and we should be working on, that we should be as a discipline, as a community, be sort of like addressing actively. So
Yeah, and it gives us also a point to know who we should be helping. Like, we should be looking out for people whose dogs have behavior issues because they might be more likely to use aversive methods.
yeah.
And it seems that those aversive methods, because they have a whole load of risks, they're not necessarily going to be helping the person in that situation anyway, or they might be making a problem worse. And they're not teaching the dog what to do instead, and they're not teaching the dog how to cope with a situation that they're finding stressful, for example. So yeah, it's really useful information. And
Sure.
then, especially from medical research, a lot of people really prioritize experimental studies, randomized controlled designs, and they are incredibly useful. Of course, the advantage of questionnaires is they're relating to how ordinary people are doing real things in the real world, whereas your experiment, you're deliberately taking something probably in your university lab and setting it up to kind of get rid of all these other variables that are going on. And that has huge advantages and then also some disadvantages as well. So experiments are really helpful, and you can set them up to show a causal relationship too. And when we have all of these different bits of research all pointing in the same direction, that can be really helpful. And if you're designing your experimental study, for example, well, whatever the topic is, you have to think really carefully about how it's going to work in the lab. Many of these studies involve training dogs to do something as well. If it's cats, then cats don't do so well in the lab. Some cats do, like you can bring kittens especially in, and a few adult cats will cope with being put in their carrier and brought into the lab. But more likely, the scientist is going to have to go to the home to meet the cat and do the study there. And even then, the cat might run and hide rather than say,
Mm.
"Oh, yes, I'd like to take part in an experiment today." So there are all these other things that can become issues when you're designing an experiment as well. And again, this is why we would want to look at the method and see exactly how someone has done something and have they designed it right so that it's useful, so that the methods used were appropriate for what you're looking at. And again, I think that's hard to do. If you're an ordinary person, that's quite difficult sometimes. But everyone can look at it and have their own opinions on it anyhow, which, is always the first place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think uh I think you always learn something. So say as a member of the public, like me, I always learn something when I'm looking at a method section. Say if there was a cat study and the researcher was using like citizen science or going to the cats' homes, having like reading the method section, and it's always a surprise to be like they had to control for this. Oh, isn't that interesting? Like you wouldn't necessarily have thought that as someone who's like, well, why can't they just tell me why cats do X, Y, Z?
Yeah, there's always so much more to think about. So you can look at it and you're right, we do learn things from how they write about how they've designed it and what they had to do and
Mhm.
how they've explained things to people or asked them to do things as well. And I think citizen science is a nice one. It not so much questionnaires. We don't really tend to call those citizen science so much. It's more when people are doing things. But all of these things require pet guardians to be willing to take part, and I think that's absolutely wonderful that people are willing and keen to take part. And I see this, sometimes researchers ask me to share links to their studies on my page, and sometimes they're looking for very specific kinds of people, and sometimes they're open to anyone in this country with a dog or anyone in this country with a cat. And it's always so heartening to see people commenting and saying, I've done it, or I've shared it with my friend or whatever. And I think that's really helpful that so many people are willing to take part and help us learn more about dogs and cats. I think that's
Absolutely.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing is sometimes we get studies that are something called a meta-analysis.
Mm.
And what that means is that someone has gone and looked for all the studies on a particular topic, like all the studies on how dogs interact with children, or all the studies on dog training methods, or all the studies on how often people play with their cats and what, if any, behavioral effects there are, that kind of thing. And again, they do this with really specific criteria. So they have to make sure that they've done that search for all the papers really well to begin with. And then they have specific ways, depending on the type of approach they take, they have specific ways of working through all of that research. And sometimes they're able to combine things statistically as well and give you an overall stats result. That's really helpful. And we have some of those, for example, we have a couple of those on dog training methods, one of which I've written about on my blog, and that was a study from a while ago now by Galziv. I'll put a link to that in the show notes if anyone wants to go and read about it. And these are helpful because they're looking to say, when you look at all the different evidence we've
Mm.
got and you put all of it together, what does it tell us? And so this is this idea that if lots of things are pointing to the same result, that gives us increased confidence that that result is true and not just an artifact of how the questions were asked or how the study was set up. I think sometimes when reading studies, we read something and we think, oh, but that doesn't apply to me, or oh, that's not what I thought would happen. And so I think sometimes people can have quite an emotional response to reading about the results of research as well. And sometimes we're like, yay, this confirms what I believe already, and we like it. And if it doesn't, then it's a bit more challenging for us, I think, to think about it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think sort of like both the meta-analysis and the emotional response to a result that doesn't necessarily feel like it fits with our own understanding of our lives or our pets. I think it can be easy for us as guardians to cherry pick a little bit, and I know I'm even guilty of this. I was writing about something that comes to mind is I was writing about dog play at one point, and I did like a little searchy search on Google Scholar, found a paper that that was what I wanted to say and just used it, right? So I think it can be easy to be like, well, here's something that says what I want, and to use that and having a meta-analysis, or I mean, if we were lucky enough to have, textbooks that are sort of would that be like meta kind of analysis and presented in plain language, that is can be very useful, and I think we can allow ourselves to be sort of open ourselves up emotionally to results that have undergone this kind of meta-analysis.
Yeah, I think so. And it could be any kind of topic. I mean, there are some topics on which people probably have quite strong emotional feelings anyway. Maybe some of the things about how people feed their dog and what is best for their
Feeding is
dog,
a big one.
because
That's what I thought of
that's
too. Yeah.
yeah, that's a big one. Maybe some things about how certain breeds of dog or cat tend to behave, or colors of cat, like black cats versus tortoiseshell cats versus grey cats or whatever. I think sometimes those are things that we can feel quite emotional about, especially if they relate to like our own particular pet. Like if I saw something about tortoiseshell cats, I'm automatically thinking, well, does this apply to Melina or not? My own cat, and
And
it can
like
feel quite.
health too, health of certain breeds, I think is a big one too. If you have an adoration for a certain breed and then you read a study about how that breed may struggle with health issues that relate to its breeding, I think is something that can be very emotionally fraught.
Yeah, and also just really hard as well, because we all want to do the very best that we can for our dogs and cats. And I think all pet guardians are doing that. And then sometimes some of these studies will show to us that actually maybe something we did in the past wasn't the best thing to do. And that
Yeah.
can be quite hard to deal with. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned stuff to do with conformation. And I mean, I have a flat faced dog. He's a Shih Tzu. He's very lovely. I got him as an adult rescue. I knew that, I mean, him coming it through at that age as a senior dog already, therefore, he didn't have the worst examples. And you can see just from looking at his face that he's not got the flattest face of a Shih Tzu out there. But he does have issues with his eyes now, which he didn't have when we adopted him, but which are very common for the breed. And I think, that I do have feelings about that. And it's hard to see. He's very good about his eye drops, but it's hard to see that he's suffered from that. So, yeah, we do have, and I think it's normal to have emotional responses. So, Just to be clear, because I mentioned meta-analyses, when someone does a meta-analysis, they have a set of rules to follow. So they are not cherry-picking particular results. They have to show that they have done their search for the papers properly and that they then have evaluated those papers according to a specific framework. And sometimes they do a narrative analysis of it, and sometimes they have other specific approaches that they want to take. But yeah, so I think it's only natural to sometimes have an emotional response, and sometimes that emotional response is, yay, dogs are amazing, or yay, cats are amazing. And sometimes it's like, oh, I wish I hadn't heard that. Now I've got to change what I do, or now I've got to think about what I do, or whatever. And I think that can be quite challenging. And of course, no individual study is perfect. For every single study, there are always limitations. And one of the things I learned quite early when writing my blog is to be really careful about those limitations, because if you list all of them, people are going to be like, well, this is rubbish. Why are you telling me about this study? And it might actually have been a really interesting study. So I only prefer to pick out the most important limitations and mention those, because otherwise everyone is just like, this is rubbish. And I think it's important to know that there is no perfect study that you can design. It would be like the most massive, totally impossible to do study if you did that. There are always like swings and roundabouts. This way is better than that way. You have to make choices. Nothing is perfect. So there always are limitations, and that's another reason why we like to go for everything together, I think.
Yeah, and what this is again shining a light on for me is I think it's useful to have people like yourself and other science communicators who can sort of ingest these studies and pop them out in a way that respects and honors like the science that went into it, but also gives the information to the public in a way that isn't based on an emotional reaction to something like, like say if you feed raw meat to your dog and then you see a study that says, oh, you might be making your partner sick because there'll be more of this kind of exposure. I think going, well, that's not right. Instead of listening to someone who is a science communicator, or and sometimes even I think scientists can be good science communicators, but that does not describe all scientists at all. So listening to someone be like, well, here's what it says and here's what this means for you, and being able to sort of absorb it and then reflect it out, and it is very useful.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think the scientists who are good at communicating about their research, I love them. They're amazing. And I really like it
Gems.
when people are like that. But it is a skill, and it is not necessarily a skill which is appreciated in academia, depending on where the person is based as well. So, everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's important that other people also are able to look at these studies. And I love writing about science. I think it's always really fun. I wanted to share one particular study with you, which I read about recently, and it's not about cats or dogs, it's about children, but it's really interesting and it's really relevant to our conversations about how we treat dogs and cats, because recently there was a re-evaluation of a much older study, actually a study from the 80s. So when you look at the research on parenting of children and the disciplinary methods that people use, there is tons and tons of research and a strong consensus that corporal punishment, hitting kids, spanking kids, is bad for them, and that those effects of it, they persist into adulthood. So it's not just bad for them in the moment, it kind of has long-lasting effects. But in some of the meta-analyses, there's been one specific study mentioned because people have used it to say it shows that spanking works. And so this, I think anyone listening who follows stuff on dog training methods will already be thinking, oh, this sounds kind of familiar. So this study shows that it works. But more recently, some scientists went back and looked at that specific study. And the thing is, as things get further and further away, it's like just this nugget gets taken out, and the details of how it was done kind of get forgotten or ignored. And so they went back to the details of how it was done. And it was a very specific instance of using punishment to enforce time out for children. And it was an experiment, so that's why people have hung on to it, is because it's an experiment. So, but it was an experiment in which it involved mothers interacting with their kids, and the scientists had an earpiece, so they spoke to the mum through an earpiece and told her how to discipline the child according to very specific rules. So that doesn't at all relate to how people use spanking or punishment in normal life with
Mm.
kids. It was this very specific instance. And also, although it showed that it did successfully enforce a timeout, it wasn't the most effective way of enforcing a timeout. They tested lots of other different methods, and some of those did not involve spanking at all and did also effectively enforce the timeout. So the result, actually, as has been stated in the literature for all of this time, is not quite what people thought. It turns out to be a lot more complex and not actually in favor of using spanking to discipline kids. And so that's really relevant because many, many countries are signed up to a charter for children. That means that they don't allow spanking of kids. Not all countries are signed up to that, but I think it's relevant to our discussions to also know that sometimes you can go back to a piece of research and reevaluate it with a modern approach. And the way in which we design experiments has changed as everything's got better. So sometimes there might be an old study that points in a particular direction, but when you go back and look at it, then it's not quite saying what people have thought it was saying over all
Yeah.
this time. So, yeah.
Yeah, someone who is somewhat familiar with the conversations that go on in the dog training realm, the fact that hurting or scaring an organism changes their behavior is not surprising at all. But the fact that it's less effective than other non hurty, scary methods to achieve the same goal is also not a surprise at all. So it is. It's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I love that people are so interested in science. So, to everyone listening to this, thank you for your interest in science. We appreciate it too because we love talking about the science. And I guess we better move on to the book section. So, what have you been reading, Kristi?
So I just yesterday I was finished a book and my Scribd service made a suggestion for a book, an essay, like just a 45-minute audiobook essay by Chuck Palahniuk, who I knew the name, but I'm not that familiar with anything further than just his name, called People's, Places, and Things, My Human Landmarks. And it's not like anything else. It's not like a book. I guess I don't really read a lot of essays, like anything I've read before. The writing is really interesting, and I found it. I was paying much instead of just listening and allowing the story itself to flow through me. I found the cadence of his writing and the way that he kept jumping around back and forth with these little sort of like linguistic signposts was very. So it's like super engaging writing and also quite a dark topic or series of topics. So I'm finding myself interested to listen to this. So yeah, it's just like a 45-minute essay. People, Places, Things, My Human Landmarks. So far, 2 thumbs up, but not like something
Cool.
that I would usually read. And
Cool.
I'm
Well,
not
it's
sure if
good.
you can see
Good
it.
to read different things. I can't really see that here, but we can find a link and put a link in the notes for it. So yeah, cool, good. Mine is a rom-com, so mine is very different. It is New Beginnings at the Cozy Cat Cafe
Oh, I love a good rom-com.
by Julie Howarth, and it is set in England. And at the very beginning of it, Tori's boyfriend has just dumped her and she's returned from Thailand alone to go back and stay with her mum for a bit. Her mum runs a cafe, and on her travels, she went to some cat cafes in Tokyo. So she kind of thinks, maybe actually we could turn the cafe into a cat cafe. And I really like that part about it because there is some really good info about like how to set up a cat cafe, what kinds of cats would like it. Like the cat's welfare is, incorporated. It's a novel,
Nice.
but the cat's
Yeah.
welfare is incorporated well. So that's really good. And also at the beginning, her own cat gets stuck up a tree and has to be rescued by a very handsome fireman. But she
Ooh.
just broke up with someone, so she's not sure if she wants a relationship. Oh,
Right.
but maybe he can actually kind of help in some way with the cat cafe or something. So, I mean, it's a very cheerful, heartwarming kind of book, and it's set in England, in the south of England, so it's also in this, like, beautiful, idyllic village setting where they're gonna set up this cat cafe, so I've enjoyed that very much.
Nice. I love it.
And so on that note, actually, I decided to pick an English location for today. So a special shout out to our listeners in Colchester in Essex. Thank you for joining us. And wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you've enjoyed this episode and if you like our podcast, please write us a review on your favorite podcast app. We would really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Positive Posting Conversation. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the show and write us a review via your podcast app. For the show notes, visit companionanimalpsychology.com. This show was produced by Zazie Todd. The music is Melody from Paris by Studio Le Bousse. See you next time.